Greetings, I-Leaders, again. Greetings, I-Leaders all over the country. Welcome to our state partners who are joining us for today's keynote. I hope everything is going well out and about in the country. I hope everyone's being fed well. That's, of course, the most important question. So this morning we had the honor of hearing from Jamie LaRue. I will briefly read his bio, though you have it in your package materials. Jamie is the author of the award-winning book, The New Inquisition, Understanding and Managing Intellectual Freedom Challenges, a weekly newspaper columnist for over 25 years and a former public library administrator. Today, LaRue writes, speaks, and consults on leadership, organizational development, community engagement, and the future of libraries. I have to say, I'm really looking forward to this. Jamie and I have run into each other a few times, and each time I found it extremely interesting and learned a lot. Back in virtual reference days and reference days, hearing about what he was doing in Douglas County with community reference, getting librarians out of the building, getting them into community organizations, connecting them together, that has been really instrumental in my thinking about libraries and community orientation. And what's really fascinating is that Jamie has a absolutely spot-on instinct for major issues in librarianship and an ability to take it beyond identification into action. And one of the things one of the reasons I'm so glad he's here to talk to our leaders is that that's what we're very much about. It's not only technology, but technology and leadership, and the idea that we're providing skills in interpersonal skills, in community understanding skills, in technology skills, and leadership skills, and management skills, not to simply say, gee, I got a lot of great skills, I can't wait to get in my office, close the door, and not talk to anyone, but to go out and make changes within our communities and within our organizations. I mean, as a quick example, when ebooks became this dire, interesting topic that were either going to make libraries obsolete or libraries weren't being part of it, rather than sitting and wringing hands, he went and created an ebook platform that people could begin to implement and use. When we talked about getting outside of buildings, he enabled a staff to get outside of buildings. And actually, the one story I have is we were on a panel together talking about reference, and we all did our bits, and then the audience began speaking, and one of the members of the audience got up and said, well, Jamie, I have to correct you, and went on to correcting something. And I thought, oh, that's nice, until I found out that she worked for Jamie. And I thought, this is to create an environment where staff feel comfortable in a constructive way, and it was a very constructive way, talk openly within a community, and the idea of managing and sharing ideas and enabling staff to do that, I found that one episode extremely telling about his approach in general. So it is my great honor and privilege, and I'm looking forward to introduce Jamie LaRue.
Thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
Well, I appreciate those very kind words. Greetings, and greetings to everyone out in the larger universe. What I want to do is kind of shift and take a step back from all the technology stuff that you've been talking about and start to talk about what I think leadership actually means. And if management is pay attention to the day, pay attention to the month, pay attention to the year, leadership is about getting ready for what's happening in 3 to 5 years. And so I believe that this is the topic we're going to be talking about today is a huge shift that's coming in our society. And we need to figure out as librarians how to talk about that. So I had read this book back in 1997 when it first came out. That's the one quoted on the bottom here, The Fourth Turning. And in 1997, they made all kinds of outrageous predictions. For instance, immigration is going to be a big thing. People are going to really care about that. There's going to be an isolationist. Be ready for something like a terrorist attack on the soil. Be ready for a bank crisis. Now, I want to say, this is not like horoscopes. It was interesting history, and I'm the sort of person where I really wasn't very good at history. It was all dates and names, and it didn't make any sense to me. But this book gave a pattern to change. And so that's what I want to communicate today, is to get us ready to think about big shifts in society and what we need to do to stay up with them. Okay, so the premises are, there are only 4 generational types, and they follow each other in American history in the same sequence over and over. The first one is the prophet, and this is the one who is all about values, The second one is the nomad, and this is the person who is survivalist and independent action, gets stuff done. The third generation, and they follow each other in the sequence, is the hero, who as young people surge forward and do great things. And the last one is the artist, kind of the sensitive empath who helps the generations bridge each other. And the two examples we have of this, one of them is Star Wars, and who is the prophet in this one? It's Obi-Wan Kenobi on the good side, and the Dark Force, Darth Vader. So just because you're a prophet doesn't mean you're good. It just means that you have power, the power of words. And then the next generation, nomad, that's Han Solo, right? So he's the independent guy who's out there, he's kind of a rogue, kind of a rascal, doesn't trust anybody, gets stuff done. The hero, Luke Skywalker. And then the artist really doesn't appear here. They're not part of that big story because typically when this is happening, the artist is the child generation at home, when big things are happening and they're just kind of staying out of the way. And the interesting thing is that when you look at Mount Rushmore, it's the right sequence. So if you kind of started over from Abraham Lincoln, then come around, so he was the prophet, George Washington was the nomad, the hero generation, the young one as we were going through the Revolutionary War, was Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence. And then the expert artist was Teddy Roosevelt. Expertise is very big for that generation. So this is something that I think we intuitively sense, that there's kind of an alignment and generations follow each other. Okay, here's the one thing that every generation has in common. We all believe that we were raised wrong, okay? And so because of that, we change our own parenting style to kind of counteract what the mistakes that our parents made with us. So to kind of run this through, again on the far side, beginning with that prophet generation, the boomers fall into that archetype. We were indulged as children. The war was over, we got new bicycles, there was you could have steak 5 times a week if you wanted it. We were indulged as children. Move on a little bit, and by the time that we had become hippies and we would do things like, let's name our kid Walden and move into the woods. He'll be fine, And so then latchkey kids, right? Almost abandoned as a generation, almost abandoned. And then there came a moment in popular history. It was 3 Men and a Baby. Remember when that movie came out? And suddenly we went from the bad news bears, like kids who were drinking and playing, sports and, this close to prostitution, right? And so suddenly it's baby on board. We have this precious child that we have to protect. And so that's a moment at which a generational style changes. I always thought that was odd too, the baby on board, these signs that suddenly showed up on cars, like you're about to hit a car, oh, baby on board, now I won't. It's very strange, but it's this consciousness change. And then the suffocated generation, and you almost have to go back to the silent generation, the kids who were small during World War II. They did not get into trouble because they couldn't afford to. And the parents would say, there are people dying. Don't cause trouble. Keep your nose clean. Stay out of trouble. And then the whole thing starts over again. So now as I think about this from protected to suffocated, I see the same thing happening now in today's small children, where the parenting style is moving from protection to suffocation. The name of this generation that's coming up, by the by, is called the Homelanders, post 9/11. Right? Okay, so then what happens? So first there's this parenting style and generational sequence. And then it's like, so your consciousness, your awareness of the world is kind of, what are the big events that happened when you were young, when you were coming of age? So the silent generation, going back, and again, I'll mostly talk about Boomer, Gen X, and Millennial because those are the generations in the workplace today, right? Silent pretty much moving out now. So for them, though it was big stuff, it was Pearl Harbor, FDR, VE, VJ days. Boomers, the 3 things that I remember, to the extent that I remember them, was Woodstock, right? And then it was the moonwalk in Vietnam. Powerful things that had a real effect on your understanding of people. It was free love, and it was war, and it was science, and all those things kind of melded together. Gen Xers, they remember the Challenger explosion, Berlin Wall, Desert Storm. And the millennials, I live not too far from where Columbine happened. And I remember the day after Columbine, I was walking through the library in Douglas County, and there was a truck that backfired out in the front, and every kid in the library jumped. Nobody else even heard it. And so it's true that big events have a significant effect on the consciousness of people growing up. Characteristics, and I'll just kind of race through some of this. The silent generation, so this is the one, the generation after the GIs, tended to be very dedicated. They were respectful of authority. They put their duty before pleasure. Expertise is a big deal. This is the most highly educated generation in America. These are the ones who said, I'm going on to get my master's degree, I'm going on to get my PhD. They really believed in expertise. And the next issue, fairness. We really didn't have in America's organizations the personnel manual until the silent generation. They came in and they said, you know what? We're not consistent enough. Let's start writing this stuff down. Let's have rules. Let's have protocols. Let's make it fair. And so that's the generation that gave us that. The boomers live to work. And I went to a fascinating workshop when I was in Minnesota where they brought in a bunch of kind of aging boomer administrators, and they were talking to millennials out there as a leadership program. And the question was, how do you avoid burning out? And the boomers looked absolutely puzzled. What do you mean? I live to work. There's no border in my life. The next generation to come along, Gen Xers, work to live, not live to work. And what I'm seeing in the millennial generation, much better notion of work-life balance. I want to have both. Boomers want to do their own thing. They are born to meet. We believe that if we meet, we've done something. In fact, I have a tattoo, born to meet, so there's a problem. Okay, let's get together, talk about it, and then leave, right? Nothing has been accomplished. We have met. We have talked. What we care about is vision and values, right? So this is a big thing. All of the continuing education done by boomers, that's what we talked about. What's our mission? What are our values? Let's keep those things ahead of us. The Gen Xers have a very different view about this. Whereas the boomer might say, why are we here? The Gen Xer says, because you pay me. What do you want? Let's move on. Let's get something done. Let's not just meet. So there's a real shift there. And they do get things done. The millennials, you probably know this, tech immediacy, right? You expect things to happen now. Or the story that I always tell is Homer Simpson is walking through the state fair and they say, I have a machine here that can deep fat fry an entire cow in 9 seconds. And Homer says, 9 seconds, but I wanted it now. You are collaborative learners, and you are astoundingly diverse as a generation. We talked about that as boomers, but those are your friends in the millennial generation. So significant progress has been made there. I also like to point out how the generations are seen by other generations. They don't like that. Silent generation, often seen as stodgy, kind of stick in the mud. My uncle, who was a Gen Xer, would go out and mow the lawn in his white t-shirt and Oxfords. Okay? Stodgy. Boomers are often seen as long-winded, which is so unfair. God. Gen Xers, blunt. Right? And so if I'm giving feedback in a personnel evaluation to a boomer, I have to be very cautious. We have to kind of go through this. I know that you're really working hard on this, but a Gen X would just say, so do I suck or what? Just tell me, okay? Blunt. And then the millennials, I remember when my daughter was 18, she'd been accepted by a university in Germany, full ride scholarship. And so I go up to talk to her, and she's in front of her Mac, and she's got a Skype session going with people who are going to that university. She's updating her Facebook page. There's a text message coming in on her phone, and I said, Maddie, look at me. And she said, Dad, I'm giving you 10% of my attention. How much do you need? Right? So perceived as ADD. And interesting, a lot of brain research has gone on about this, and we can say that, in fact, the whole idea of multitasking is false. It's not true, right? What is true is that some people can shift their attention from one thing to another faster, and millennials can do that. You can reset the button much faster than a boomer can. And then I think this is important as we start thinking about what is actually happening with institutions. So if you grew up in the shadow of World War II, you believed in a command and control structure. You thought institutions had to be respected, okay? If you came along as a boomer, respect an institution. My parents, who were GIs, in that generation, they would say, you can't fight City Hall. And I said, but there's a sit-in at City Hall. Of course we can fight City Hall. If there's a conflict between my values and the institution, one of us has to change. And if it's a boomer, it's the institution that has to change. And I believe that's why, as a generation, we have been responsible for institutional destruction. We have destroyed almost every institution we have passed through. Gen Xers look at an institution and say, they can't be trusted. And I was talking about this earlier with David. So let's think about this. So that latchkey generation experienced the greatest number of divorces in American history. So the first institution they saw was marriage, broken. They came to schools after we had passed through and broken them. And so the lowest scores, because any teacher who was still sane was over-medicated, right? Then they got out into the workforce just in time for a recession, and layoffs and major kind of problems. And the whole idea about a long-term association with a job, they didn't even expect it. They didn't believe it. So what that means is that their idea of institutions is deeply suspicious, with cause. And then finally, millennials. I remember once I got a phone call from somebody with the newspaper, and they said, so where are the young people in Douglas County? And I said, they are in minivans. Right? They're not out playing. They are being taken from one play date to soccer to they are over-scheduled. And so their big question, their feeling about institutions is that some of them can be trusted and some cannot. It's conditional. So the way I summarize all these different attitudes, what does each generation bring to a workplace? So the silent generation, they say, how are we going to do it? How are we going to make sure it's fair? What's the process we're going to follow? Boomers want to know why, vision and values. Gen Xers want to know, what was it that you wanted me to do? Just tell me. And for millennials who are desperately overscheduled, it's like, so when did you need it? Okay? Which one of these questions is right? All of them, right? And so the point that I want to make about this is that it is not the case that one generation is better than another. It is the case that the changes that we see in social moments and parenting styles and the orientation that they bring to organizations are essential. You cannot have a successful organization that doesn't ask every one of these questions. Famous examples. Martin Luther King was a silent. Do we believe in fairness? Okay? The whole civil rights thing was about that. It was about fairness. Bob Dylan, many people think of as a boomer. And also say that these birth years that I put up there are rough guides. Different historians will say different years, and it could be that you were raised as a Gen Xer in a household full of boomers. Are you going to have more of an association with boomers? Probably. So this is a rough kind of thing. Just a quick check. Do we have any silent in the room? Okay. Boomers? Gen X? Okay. About what you would predict at this moment in history, right? Boomers starting to move out, Gen Xers kind of assuming leadership roles, and millennials. Okay. And again, the reason that I want to talk about this is that going back to look at The Fourth Turning, that book, with you getting into the workplace right now, makes it fresh and interesting to me all over again. Okay, boomer greats, Bill Clinton, Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, all people that have no separation between their work life and their home life, right? Gen Xers, a lot of, and I love this, it's tech and comedians. I love that. I love that. And I'm also very taken by this. At a time when you're not sure if you trust your institutions, the only news people that my children listened to were Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert. And millennials, Zuckerberg. So again, we've got a lot of social collaboration, a lot of a focus on talking to each other. And I put Jennifer Lawrence up there because she and Katniss Everdeen are sort of the good look at what we expect of millennials. Heroic. Okay, here's your whole life. So no matter who you are, you can run this through. And again, I'll say, you may feel that you are not in sync with your generation. You may feel that you've hated them your whole life. Nonetheless, as you look around, you say, generally speaking, this profile by phase of life is roughly accurate. And so if you were a boomer, you were indulged as a child. When you came of age as a young adult, you were narcissistic and self-absorbed to a fault. Okay? As we got into midlife, the culture wars began. Okay? Tea Party. We have people who cannot compromise, right? Legislation 50-50. No, we will brook no compromise. And then, after a long life, we finally, if we make it to elderhood, often move into, if history is any guide, something like visionary statesmanship. The power of words, maybe some wisdom. Okay? If you were a nomad, you started off a nomad, again being Gen Xer, unprotected, underprotected as a child. Move into young adulthood where you're alienated, don't trust institutions, there's no easy way to connect, you're kind of off there trying to survive. By midlife, have kind of settled down, have figured out, you've had kids probably, you are very focused on their well-being, and you are pragmatic. The last big generation of Gen Xers before the current one, the one that was like this, were the generals in World War II. Dwight Eisenhower, people who got stuff done. And then, yeah, this one looks like fun, right? So when you get to be elder, exhausted, conservative, and suspicious. You don't trust banks, your money's in a mattress. You know, you don't expect there to be a pension, you're investing in your kids, okay? I have a lot of sympathy for Gen Xers. I think that their life has not been easy. The heroes tend to be protected as children. They are challenged when they come of age, and they tend to do this big team response. The last hero generation, GIs. And I think it's also interesting to me, too, is that those of you who remember your grandparents or now have grandchildren, is that you often have more in common with them. You know, in part because we share a common enemy, which is the generation in between. But it's also because things come around, you know, and you start to remember, yeah, it was like this when I was a child. In midlife, the GI generation was very hubristic. And by that, what I mean, full of themselves, they could make no mistakes. Vietnam was an example of that. I can remember when I was in high school, we had ROTC. So walk out of school, and there's ROTC doing a march. Then the young socialists come along to protest the Vietnam War, and then all of the former GIs burst out of the paddy wagon and started hitting people all over the head with their batons. Hubristic, full of themselves. So not their best phase of life. And then as elderhood, this was the generation that created the AARP, right? Very busy, very active, very politically savvy, fairly well-to-do, fairly active. And then the artist, overprotected, maybe even suffocated as a child. And then when they come to young adulthood, very conformist. The silent generation is the one that invented going steady, right? They wanted to know they had a date for Saturday night, okay? Very conformist. But then, just about the time that they got into the workforce, and they said, okay, now the reins of power come to us, the baby boomers had come along and shaken everything up. So we broke many of their expectations. And so they were kind of indecisive. They went back to school. They became trusted advisors, but they tended not to be the leaders because the boomers pushed them out of the way. And I can't remember if I said this, but there really are differences in the numbers of the people in each generation. There were 80 million 80 million boomers, 40 million Gen Xers, 80 million millennials. So there's kind of a boom, bust, right? So the generation in between is something of a shadow generation and spends much of its life adapting to the blowhards on either side. And then elderhood for the Gen Xers, or for the silent generation, they tend to be very sensitive. They're great grandparents, and they really do explain generations to each other. So now I want to kind of get to the heart of this. So now let's talk about, as people move through these generations, as they move through the change of life, there get to be changes in social moments. And according to Strauss and Howe, they would say, let's go all the way back to the first turning here, and that was post-World War II. So now we have, the GIs have come back, they're building houses like crazy, they're having kids, and what's characteristic about this time is that it is characterized by a strong social consensus. Everybody's pretty much in the same boat. Unions, buy a new American car every couple of years, everybody belongs to a bowling league, right? So strong social consensus. People find it hard to, when they go back and look at legislative activity from the 50s and the early 60s, what was happening was that there would be 8 big pieces of legislation that would be passed with 80 to 90% majorities. Hard to imagine that now, right? Now it's 5,000 bills and everything is 50-50. So the second turning, that passionate era of spiritual upheaval, where the civic order is attacked. Any guesses? What year was that? It was the 60s, right? Some boomers who came along later had their 60s and the 70s, but that's what was going on. Okay? A fundamental challenge. This is where students went to universities and did sit-ins, and you couldn't run an institution unless the students agreed. Okay? The third turning, a downcast era of strengthening individualism and weakening institutions. They put that as really kind of the inauguration of Ronald Reagan. So he came on and he said, even though he was talking about a city on the hill, since then, most people would say our infrastructure is falling apart, right? Bridges literally fall apart. I was talking to a friend who lives in Chicago, and she said that there's problems with the L. You know, a lot more breakdowns than there used to be. We're not fixing stuff. Now, I want to kind of point out that there's something that's kind of cool about both ends of the extreme. When we're at this point of weakened social consensus, we kind of miss that. But the truth is we have extraordinary freedom, right? As individuals, we can customize the heck out of our lives. And if you go back to that time of great social conformity, it was very hard to be an individual. And if you didn't want to be in a bowling league, you were made to feel like an outcast, right? So there's freedom at both ends of these things, strong social consensus, and a high, that first turning, strong individual freedom in the third turning. And then here was the prediction that Strauss and Howe made. They said not sooner than 2005, not later than 2020, there will be a huge secular crisis. In America's past, those crises have been the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, and World War II. Those of you who have draftable children or grandchildren, as I do, worry about this a lot. But again, is this a prophecy? Do we know? Hard to say. Fascinating to me, like if you go back and look at Pearl Harbor, the mood in America before Pearl Harbor was much like the mood today. Great contention. You know, a lot of disagreement across the board, no sense of, you know, this was the post-prohibition, nobody trusted anybody, argue, argue, argue. Pearl Harbor happened and snap. America went into alignment because all of the generations were in the right order, in the right place. The boomer type generation, the prophet generation, FDR, had moved into elder statesmen, finally seasoned enough. The lost generation, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, wild youth, reckless gambling, some made it big, some lost big, pragmatic, midlife, generals. The hero generation, the GIs, young, collaborative, tech-savvy, soldiers. and the artist generation at home. When that generation alignment is ready, when the incident happens, because incidents always happen, then the consensus occurs. 9/11 was too soon. It was 2001. And so everybody was half a generation off in the cycles. And so America snapped into place for about 2 weeks, right? And then fell apart, okay? So I mention all this to say, if this logic is true, whether or not there's war, and I don't mean to be, a prophet of doom here, but to say that there do appear to be predictable cycles in American history, and if we want to be good leaders, we should get ready for that. When I was in Douglas County, when I first got there, we were ranked as the worst public library in the state of Colorado. By every measure, we were at the bottom of the list. And I said, okay, I want to try to fix this. And we figured out what all of the various measures were: circulation per capita, visits per capita, and we went after those things. And by the end of 16 years, we were ranked as the #1 public library in the nation for our population size. The use had increased tremendously, some 3-4 times greater than any other library in the United States. And then we went to the voters for an election, and we lost. Lost. I was absolutely devastated. I said, how can it be that I'm surrounded by all these Republicans who say, run it like a business? And I say, we are the most successful business in the United States. We have no debt of any kind. We've built 7 libraries with savings. We are ranked as the #1 library. What do you want from me? And then lost. It's like, well, if you're that good, then you don't need any more money. Okay? So this fascinating thing is that, so for the past generation, librarians, boomer librarians largely, have been responsible for the greatest increase in the use of libraries, because we understand that the narrative of our time is what's in it for me. Somebody wants to come in and say, my taxes are too high. I was talking about this with somebody earlier. Say, okay, how many of you have television at home, and what do you pay per month? People say, well, it's anywhere from $60 up to, if you're in Douglas County and DirecTV is there, $300 a month, right? How many of you have internet access at home? What do you pay per month? How many of you have cell phones? Is there anybody in America who doesn't have a cell phone, right? Well, add up these things and you say, well, what is the purpose of these monthly expenditures? Education, right? I've got TV at home and I'm watching documentaries. Okay, or it's recreation, because, all right, I watch pro wrestling, it's funny, all right? Then you say, or it's social connection. I've got a Facebook account, and that's how I stay in touch with people, okay? And you say, well, what does that cost you per month? And it's $300 to $500 a month. What do public libraries cost the average homeowner on a monthly basis? First thing you realize, we don't know, right? We don't talk about it that way. But the answer is $2.60 per month. So somebody says, my taxes are too high. And you go, and how much do you pay for pro wrestling? Okay. We have forgotten how to talk value. And what we say is that, well, here's what's in it for you. You come into the library, and it's totally customized to your experience. You come in, and we stop everything, and we help you answer your question, right? Your convenience. The whole focus on customer relations over the past 20 years of librarianship is an understanding that we had to sell the library as a personal convenience. Okay? What's in it for me? Personal values over institutional values, it's all about your rights. Well, I have a right to be well treated. I have a right to have access to this. Absolutely. That's the language of boomers, rights. You are a consumer, right? And again, the same shift that went from patron to customer service is to say, you're not a citizen, you're a consumer. It's everything is what's the cost, what did I get for it, what's in it for me? And then how many of you have heard you should run it like a business, right? Well, I wonder about this because 90% of businesses fail in the first year, Maybe it should be run it like a successful enterprise. as opposed to run it like a business. In America, what we do is we give the problems that nobody can make money on to government, right? Because they're still necessary. We still have to have them. So running it like a business doesn't make sense, in my view. Okay, so the other argument is the argument of the public good. And this has so fallen out of favor in America that you hardly ever hear it anymore. Maybe we still talk about it in library school. And from 1850 to 1920 was a period that was known as the public library movement. They were being established all across the country. They didn't use the language on the left. They used the language on the right. And they said, what's in it for us? Institutional values over personal values. It was a period of high immigration and great distrust of all of these non-Americans moving in. So we needed institutions to shape them up, right? To let them know that they were citizens. Public libraries were one of them, because when somebody got finished at their stint at the mine, they were going to come in and read great literature and ennobled themselves, and they were going to become informed citizens. Never mind that they were reading the Bobbsey Twins and True Detective, and which actually I think was probably a smarter investment anyhow. We have been connected in America to each other mostly through fiction, not through nonfiction. And I would argue that Tom Swift had more to do with our love of technology than any nonfiction book ever written. But anyhow, so then the idea is that now we're not talking rights, we're talking responsibilities. We have a responsibility to each other. If you're a businessman, you are proud to support your local library, because that's how you know you're a citizen. That's the price of citizenship. And again, that whole focus is it's not just what's in it for me. It's like I'm investing in my community, and that's smart. That's what it means to be a good citizen. To go off on a little rant here about taxes, I love that when they couldn't catch Al Capone, they finally got him for tax evasion, right? And so at about that time, if you went up and you criticized somebody, are you an ethical person? They'd say, I pay my taxes. Okay? You don't hear that anymore. Now the libertarian philosophy is that taxation is theft. It's theft. You're stealing my money. And there's a reason for that. When Lyndon Baines Johnson defeated Goldwater, Bill Buckley and some other conservatives got together and they said, we're tired of losing national elections. We need to put together a new frame. So whenever one of these liberal presidents stands up and says something, we have to be the other side. And we're going to use two words that build a new frame. These two words are tax burden. Tax burden. That didn't exist before then. And so, as with almost everything else, the first time I say tax burden, you go, burden? The second time you say, yeah, I've heard that. Third time, it's like, I hear that a lot. And the fourth time, it's like, that must be true. Now, if you look at the 1040 form, when you're filling out your taxes, tax burden is in the form. They had been repeating these two words for over 60 years. And it plays absolutely into the left-hand side of this. What's in it for me? Now, if I were to sit down with you and say, okay, let's take all of your taxes and I'll show you what you get, the best bargain in the world, right? Taxes are smart, they are cheap, and they buy you clean water. Wow, clean water is unknown in places where there is no government. Kills more people than anything. So, the argument here finally is the public good. And here's what I believe. This is what I want you to take away from this discussion, is that with the shift in social moment, as the generations start to change, the institutions that use this language will thrive because America is ready for it. It may not look like it, right? But it's ready for it. It's overdue. So what I want to talk about now is that, so what are the messages and what are your talking points for rising leaders in America's libraries? And I think my focus is mostly public libraries, but I believe it applies to academic, I believe it applies to schools, I believe it applies to special libraries as well. The first one is, when there is a hurricane on the East Coast, libraries are there. Where will you gather? We helped you charge your cell phones. We had meetings every day to coordinate emergency responses. We are there for you. Ferguson, where did you go? The library. That's the first message. The second one is we think ahead, and I was really fascinated by this. If you take a look at like the library visits and museum visits, way more, many times more than all of the sporting and entertainment events combined, right? Tremendous traffic. Why is it then that libraries and museums are not as well funded as a new sports arena? And the answer is, what the survey suggests, is that in America, we think you pay for things that are about the future. You don't pay for things that are about the past. And so in that era where it's all about what's in it for me, if I'm saying, well, we preserve and we remember stuff, you go, that's the past. In America, we believe in progress. So let me share with you the best research that I've run across. This is from a woman, Mariah Evans, from the University of Nevada in Las Vegas. She did a 20-year study of 27 different nations, okay? Hefty amount of research. And she went back and said, what can we determine about the effect of books in a home? If we can get 500 books into the home of a child between the ages of 0 and 5, it's as good as having 2 parents with master's degrees, regardless of the actual education of the parents, regardless of the income of the parents. What's the greatest single predictor of whether you will be free or in jail? 4th grade reading scores. Greatest single predictor of how healthy you will be as a child and how long you'll live as an adult. 4th grade reading scores. Greatest predictor of how much education you'll get and how much money you'll make. 4th grade reading scores. What's the best predictor of 4th grade reading scores? Reading readiness by age 5. What's the greatest predictor of reading readiness? Books in the home. So just saying, if we want to build fewer prisons, put more books in the home. If you want your children to be healthier and you want them to live longer, get more books in the home. If you want them to be productive citizens and have education, to be good citizens, get more books in the home. We can save the world by investing in the future. But that's long-term thinking, isn't it? You're not going to see an immediate turnaround in crime if you put a book in a child's home. It requires the common good, thinking about the common good. And I also argue this whole thing about globalism, which is why I picked that lovely little picture, is that thinking ahead is about, I get so amazed sometimes about we believe things that our media tells us. And what I found so fascinating about what was happening with democracy in the Middle East was that the media couldn't keep up. There was something that was happening, and we were so wired that people were texting, or they were posting on Facebook, or they were sending out SMS messages about what was really going on. And when that happens, the public lie is harder to maintain. There's too much data. Looking ahead, connecting people to technology and how to communicate is another way to change the world and to prevent the overreach of government. One of the arguments that I love to make about what's happening in libraries, what I think is really behind the maker movement, is like if we allow ourselves, back to the ebook crisis, to say that we are the last link in a distribution channel, all we do is we hand stuff along, then technology disruption can cut us out of that distribution chain. My argument was always that at Douglas County Libraries, we put a big banner on the website that had 4 million visitors a year. We would say, want to write a book? And here's what I've learned. Everybody wants to write a book, like 95% of the human race. They will click that. And then it pops up and it says, want to write a good one? Because that's different, right? And so what we've seen, and the argument that I kept trying to make to the profession, is that in 2008, there were 300,000 mainstream press, 60,000 titles a year from independents, and 10,000 self-published. Last year, 300,000 mainstream, 290,000 independent, 580,000 self-published. Okay? And before you say it's all crap, some of it's crap, but almost 20% of the New York Times bestseller list is now self-published. The argument I use for this one is that I wrote a book, The New Inquisition, available from Libraries Unlimited for the low, low price of $40. First time author, I got a contract for 10%. Okay, not bad. And typically, the stretch is 8% up to about 15, even for big authors. A friend of mine, a retired psychotherapist, wrote this fascinating fringe book, Holocaust survivor's son meets abused woman in Kansas. They fall in love. That's chapter 1. Chapter 2, let's stop and psychoanalyze everybody's motives. What? You know, fascinating, interesting, fringe, never would have made it past the gatekeepers, right? Because it was too weird, but really well done. He paid an editor, they cleaned up the language, and I said, Frank, let's publish this electronically. So we sat down in front of Amazon, went to Create Space, 4 questions. First, Amazon does not ask you who you are because Amazon knows who you are. Right? What is the name of your book? Type it in. Do you need an ISBN? Click here, we'll sell you one for $1. Okay. Have you got a cover for your book? Even an ebook needs a cover, really does, makes a big difference. Yes, I do. Click here to upload it. Do you have your manuscript in Microsoft Word? Yes, I do. Click here to upload it. 3 minutes, 4 questions, global publication. Global publication. Time to market, as fast as you can write. Okay? And then Amazon asked you another question. Will you agree to sell this book for $9.99? And if you do, you will make $7 on the sale. Let's review. 40, make 4. 10, sell a lot more copies at 10, make 7. What do you think the future of publishing looks like? Librarians aren't doing anything about that. 2/3 of what's being written today, the greatest explosion of writing in the history of mankind, we don't know anything about. We don't collect it. We don't know how to buy it. We don't know how to store it. We don't know how to review it. That's a crisis. The only way out of it is to make alliance with the creators so that people see us not as gatekeepers, but as gardeners. Okay? We need to grow creative talent in our communities. This other idea is a wonderful thing. In fact, the first good data about this that I ran across was in Chicago, where Mayor Daley II said, okay, we have a lot of broken neighborhoods, how do we fix them? And it was a 3-part strategy. First, he put a library there because it brought the right kinds of eyes to the street. Now mothers are there with children, they're walking through, they're kind of watching this every day. There's a pulse of traffic that happens. Second thing was public transportation, and third was a park. Those 3 things undid some of the worst neighborhoods in Chicago and made them pretty nice places to live. Libraries make places better. The other thing that some wonderful studies have been done about what's called the halo effect. It turns out you can't just go to the library. You have to go somewhere else and spend money, right? It's just human nature. Okay, kids, let's take our books back to the library. Oh, a Dairy Queen. You know? And so this halo effect is like every library visit is worth $20 to a community, just because it got them out and about and in a car and people were out doing things. Libraries make things better. If we have story times that small children come, the parents who didn't know each other make friends. You teach them to start imagining themselves inside somebody else's life. The best way to ensure compassion is to tell stories to children, right? We make things better. Oh, and actually awards. I was fascinated by this. The American Library Association and its awards are responsible for selling a lot of books. We really are. Turns out that we are highly regarded. And making something better, putting a badge on it like that, giving an award, that's an audio award. I just like the Odyssey connotation. I saw that somebody had put on one of your flip charts, what do we even mean by community? Well, here's what it means. In America, we are the only place left where you don't have to pay to hang out with other people. We are common and neutral ground. You move to a new place, you don't know anybody, you don't hang out, maybe you hang out at a coffee shop, maybe you hang out at a bar, maybe you go to sporting events, maybe you go to a church. But a library is some place where you can just go hang out and join a conversation without having to declare a religious preference or pay money. A powerful, powerful way to knit together an unraveled time. If this is the unraveling, the third turning, we are one of the few places that can start to stitch our communities back together. You can trust us. I recognized that when I first became a librarian, you would go out and you would talk to various business people. People trust us. Why do they trust us? And I think it's because, in some ways, it's the old stereotype of the spinster librarian, but rectitude, right? You don't hear about corrupt librarians, right? Generally speaking, we're service-oriented. We have high ethics. When we talk about to our new librarians as we train them, we focus on ethics. We focus on freedom of access, confidentiality. And we don't break those things very often. One of the most powerful assets we have in a time where people distrust government. Tell me about the last really good thing you heard about schools. Right? What has happened to schools was a profound attack on the public nature of public funding. Let's privatize it. Let's make it vouchers. Let's figure out a way to, if we could just require all these kids to buy computers, we could make a killing. It's not even a public bid in a private school, right? Libraries have managed so far to retain the trust of people because we're not selling anything at them. We're not really pushing an agenda other than access. It's a powerful, powerful thing. So preserving that trust is important. And my last message here, I'm not even sure what time it is that I really do believe we will endure. As I talk to many people who are involved in public institutions, they're worried about their future. And I think that maybe a couple of years ago, I heard more of this in libraries than I hear now. Because we are creative. Because we can be trusted. Because we are values-centered. Because we are poised on the edge of a new renaissance to reclaim the value of the public good. We will endure because not only, as I put on your phrase, not only do we collect stories, libraries themselves are the best story the human race has ever told. So, those are my comments, and the piece of paper that I gave you when you walked in the door can also be found here, so our viewers who are elsewhere, feel free to go to that web address and pull down a little more information about this kind of generational shift. And now I would like to open up to any questions or comments. Sir?
What about generations of immigrants coming to this country? My mom's parents came in the 20s, my dad came in the 50s. So how does that generational thing work with people from foreign countries?
And I suppose I should restate this for others. So the question is, does this kind of generational cycle apply to immigrants who may be coming in from a different kind of a background? And the best research that I've seen suggests that probably not, that each country almost has its own cycle. But I think what happens is that, what's the first thing that an immigrant does? Try to fit in, right? And so if you notice that the dominant mode of the day is everybody's talking about what's in it for me, well, that's what it is to be here in America. Come in at a time when the language is more about the common good, that's how you fit in. So I think that we regularize immigrants to our cycle pretty quickly. Sir?
A statement and observation. I think a profound force, other than what you've described here, and probably one of the most profound forces we've ever had up to and including the invention and discovery of fire, is birth control.
Ah, interesting.
And I believe that it is completely, profoundly changing the way genders work, society works, the whole premise of how we're built as a bigger species. And I think that's something we need to, I mean, it's this low hum in the background, but I think it's going to become more and more important as that effect is felt further down.
So again, for the audience elsewhere, is that the comment is that birth control may be as powerful a force as anything we've talked about here. And I'd like to think more about that. Two cases that I know. One is personal. Many of my father's people were raised in northwest Arkansas, very rural, very remote. First child tended to be born when the mother was 14. Okay, and so now what happens? I go back and I see my cousins, and when my kids were small, they were grandparents. Okay, and what they were doing, these grandmothers, is they were taking their prepubescent grandchildren into doctors to have contraceptive implants. And so that was the first time that they were graduating from high school, because they didn't have kids. So I suspect that you're right, there's something powerful happening there. And then on the other side is that in some countries, China as an example, birth control and selective abortion based on gender means that we now have something like a huge discrepancy in the number of boys versus the number of women, which I would argue eventually those guys are going to want to get married. And then you're going to have a different kind of a thing, and that would be, you know, those of you who are entrepreneurs, it's time for an international dating service. Let's get to work on that, because the alternative might be war, right? That's what happens when you have a lot of untamed boys with raging hormones.
Speaking of which,
Yeah, by example.
So if you don't mind me asking for a little therapy through this, because it's very interesting to identify. Whenever you put these classes there, so I'm the Gen-Xer, and I think it's, looking through this framework, it's not coincidental that instead of talking about a vision for libraries, I talked about a mission for libraries.
Right.
Instead of sort of whatever, it's let's go do this, let's go do it. And one comment you made about the library being the last place in the community people come, you use the word neutral, which I'm not a big fan of, but this is actually leads to the question. When you talk about this community good, when you talk about this shift, I too sense less the world is falling apart and libraries are going away, but I do sense this shift from libraries as a civic organization that is sort of there and available to a civic shaping organization.
Yes.
And the idea that it's moving from an institution of service to an institution of social transformation. Is that fit into this shifting that we're talking about?
Okay, so again to repeat, the notion that David senses that what's happening with libraries now is not just we're there to serve all people, but we are actively trying to transform our communities. So there's a more activist role that's emerging. And I would say that, again, to kind of flip back to what happens in the turnings. So in the first turning, what we saw was strengthening institutions, okay? And now we've had many weakening institutions. So absolutely this is on point. The next phase is to say, no, we are not passive, corrupt, inefficient, wastes of taxpayer dollars. We are actively making our communities better. And so again, my focus here is to say that if you talk about things the way they used to be, you sound like you're outdated and you're old and nobody pays attention to you. If you begin to speak about what the next phase is, you're generating energy about something new, you are calling out the future, that's leadership. So I think that fits very well into this model. Sir?
But do you think that that shift might harm the trust that people have in libraries?
Okay, so the question there is that, so if you are an activist institution that says, we will transform the libraries, people look at you and they go, and who are you to transform the library? Or what if I don't like the direction that you're heading? So is there risk there? Yes, there is risk. There is risk. And the alternative is to wait passively for somebody else to do it, or to step in and say, and I think that there's a difference here too, is that I think the kind of leadership that we've been talking about, community reference, librarians who are principled and trusted, is that you don't go out and tell them how to transform. You go out and convene the meeting, inform people to say, how do we make a decision together, and we will help you implement that. And so I think that leadership isn't telling people what to do. Leadership begins with listening, convening the conversation. Sir.
You mentioned earlier in your presentation about the mantra of run things like a business.
Right.
Now we see repeatedly government elected officials trying to run government like a business.
Right.
Why is that?
I think that it goes back to, well, actually, what jumped out at me is, see that narcissistic and self-absorbed? I think a lot of it is that. And I think that it's this difference between the narrative. If you have lost social consensus, what you're saying, everything is a transaction, right? And that's what defines business. A business is successful when it's making a profit, okay? An individual profit. So let's take a look at all the transactions. Let's boil everything down to what's it cost and what do I get? And that kind of makes sense from that perspective. But the problem is that, again, there are things that you can't make money at. I remember as I was getting feistier before I left Douglas County, I had a local legislator who stood up and he says, you know, and government doesn't create jobs. Same sort of thing, right? Only businesses create jobs. Governments don't create jobs. And I said, so the firemen who ran into the buildings on 9/11 didn't have jobs? And you're saying that a policeman doesn't have a job, and you're saying that if we pass a bond to build a road, that the construction workers don't have work? And don't we pay you? You know, and so I think what happens is, as is often the case, you take something that has a little bit of truth to it. Do we want our organizations to be run efficiently? Yes. Should it be well managed? Yes. Core of truth in that. And you say, run it like a business, and repeat it and repeat it and repeat it, and people start to think it must be true because they've heard it so often. So become the voice for the right-hand side of the slide. Start standing up to say, let's talk about the common good. And it seems to me that when my library went in and bought an abandoned grocery store in a falling apart part of town, we saved the neighborhood. It was a smart public investment. Talk that language, change the dialogue. Sir.
Just a quick observation, because you'd mentioned, while this has a sort of veneer of public librarianship, this is very applicable to many settings. I mean,
Absolutely.
For example, I had a dean at a university and was looking at the library and going through the budget and said, oh my God, I found it. I found the reason that the library is suffering. It's the subscription budget. It's huge, right? And suddenly discovered the fact that we have to pay for databases, right? But the solution that he proposed was, this is easy. Clearly not every school is using every one of those databases equally. What if we differentiated the price into, you know, so arts and sciences will pay for these and physics will pay for these. But it's very much these two columns. And when you talk about a space where you don't have to go plain fealty to a religion or buy things, in many places the academic library has become the place where you're not in a school or in a dorm. Right. It's a place you can go and mix across the different disciplines and stuff. So I just pointing out the obvious. But,
So I don't know if I can summarize that, but the idea is that the principle up here about individual benefit, cost control is happening in the academic world as well. Absolutely. Yes?
I'm interested in the words you would say to some of our policymakers who are now more and more from a really privileged background.
Right.
I mean, ultra privileged, who their association with libraries is abstract at best. Maybe they have a library in their home, but just how you would connect the dots for these men and women who are from backgrounds that are not shared by the vast majority of us.
Okay, well, the question there is that how do you make the pitch to people from increasingly rarefied and wealthy backgrounds who are now in positions of public trust to say that these social investments are necessary? I've got several kind of reactions to that. One of them is, remember the Outline of History written by Will and Ariel Durant? It's like this thing of books. I didn't read that. I read the little thing at the end that said the lessons of history. It's like 110 pages. And they said that one of the things that has happened throughout history is that even if a society starts equal, some people are a little more ambitious, smarter, greedier, whatever, and they make more money than others. And then the next generation happens, and they are starting with more cash, and the next generation happens, and the cash has grown, and every civilization over time winds up with the 1%. Okay? There are only two solutions, said Will and Ariel Durant. One of those is progressive taxation, forced redistribution of wealth. The second one is armed revolution. Okay? Guillotine. So let's think ahead. And, and then the other side of this is that, but this argument, of course, would not work, right? If you were to say that to a wealthy person, it would not work. But what you could say is that we have done some analysis, this is true, and I can give you the story of somebody who could have been a criminal who was on that path, but because of the library wasn't. Because of the library is now a respected person who contributes to your campaign. Your alternative is you buy 500 books through a library to save that child's life, or you build a prison at $50,000 a year per person. We have the highest incarceration rate in the world for an advanced nation, right? And so I'll look at this and say, well, you say you want to save money, but you're not making a very smart business decision. And then the other side about this is almost another talk, but I think that the problem with librarians, because of our ready access to information, is we keep thinking that facts change people's minds. Nothing to do with it. And I told someone this story the other day about when we were doing a library campaign. Our campaign manager was next door to an African-American woman who was a doctor, and they're out throwing out the trash, and she says, Jason, how's it going? And he says, oh, it's great, I'm working on the library campaign. And her face gets very stony, and she said, oh, I voted against the library, and I'm going to vote against it again. I would have argued with her. And Justin said, tell me about the first time you used a library. And her face softened, and she went, that's the first place I was treated with respect. I should have voted for the library. And so the problem is that despite all, and I've just inundated you with data, right? But the truth of it is, what changes minds is to start with the heart and to start with the story. And I think that this is one area that librarians have a lot to learn. We are not effective advocates as witnessed by the last generation of declining support. We're talking data when data doesn't change anybody's mind. We need stories.
And the experience, to have them to experience what you were talking about. We often do that through stories.
Yes.
But to have them actually sit on the seat where this person came from, or to see the outcome of that person sitting in that seat is a more greater mind changer than anything.
Point here is that it is the experience of someone else's life that is just as powerful as the story. I absolutely agree. Yes?
What is your, I really like the point about the fourth grade reading levels. What is your best source for that information?
Do the search for Mariah Evans, University of Las Vegas, University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and 500 books. I've got it on my blog too because I'm citing this everywhere. And just to remind everybody is that often librarians will say, we need more data. We don't need any more data, okay? That's 20 years of 27 countries. It's enough. It's enough, okay? Now we need stories. Sir?
I think thinking about, and probably this is because we're in the middle of a fractious time, is that how we're gonna come back together again. I think in the past, something could happen, and there would be kind of a common experience. And now with Twitter and everything else, everybody has their own personalized feed, and I don't know my neighbors. I haven't had to know my neighbors in the 5 years that I've lived. And I'm not sure what's gonna bring my building together, you know, much less the community, other than like an asteroid hitting.
Right.
And so I think that's gonna be interesting to see how you can get these people who are paying attention to their own online community to get into it.
Yeah, and that's a couple of comments about this. So the comment here is that we now have so many sources of information. You know, there was a time when at the end of the day you went home and you watched the one news guy out of your 3 channels, and there was a kind of a sense of consensus. Well, now something happens, and even if it's a big triggering event, everybody has their own customized way of getting that information, and is it going to be harder to bring everybody together? And that's a possibility. As I say, this is a prediction, and so look me up, invite me back in 2020, and we'll see how well we did. And there are some other things I wonder about too, is like this, despite all of the armed conflict we've had as a nation, this is one of the most relatively peaceful times in the history of mankind. And why is that? I sometimes think it's because when you watch something on TV now, you see the real cost of war. You know, where the media is much more visceral than it was before. Is that going to change some of these patterns? It might. But nonetheless, I do think that the broad outlines of these phases remains true. You know, I hope that there's not a war. But I think that what will happen is that in times of crisis, you know, and this happened when the hurricanes happened, it happened in Ferguson, people left the building, they turned away from the internet, and they went somewhere where they could be with each other. And where did they go? The library.
All right, one last hand. Thank you very much for giving me. I sometimes wonder if thinking generationally, the issue of too many sources of information and too many small communities is radically different from, say, the Depression era of the 20s when there wasn't enough connectivity and everyone had very localized information then as well. So these are what I hope you take advantage of during the I Lead You sessions, et cetera, is the ability to engage in large-scale ideas, right? One of the things that oftentimes, actually I think it was Jeff Penka who said this at our last session, I don't have time to plan, I don't have time to think big, I don't have time to think long-term, I'm constantly putting out fires, to which Jeff Penka replied, do you really think firemen don't plan before they go into a burning building? Right? You know, that's where they spend their time thinking about it. So I hope you take advantage of these large-scale ideas. And I hope that you join in and be part of them. At this point, I'm going to say goodbye and thank you to our states until tomorrow. And for us, we are going to take a break so we can prepare for lunch.